ايه ده؟ Yeah. Good evening, everyone. How's everyone doing? Great. Very good. So we're happy to have Magid with us tonight to lead us into one of the most, like the easiest book in the Bible. The easiest book to read. The book of Numbers. Probably one of the books that we kind of skip next. Right? And it's, I think, one of the characteristics, it has a lot of numbers. So I'm personally excited to learn tonight. So we all learn together about the book of Numbers. So please join me in welcoming Magid as he leads us into this.
Hello. I don't know if this is. And my voice is loud enough, anyways. I don't think we need it, but is it on?
It's on, yeah.
Okay. Is it working well for you guys? No.
It's for the recording.
It's for the recording.
Oh, I see. Okay. All right. طيب, the book of Numbers. This will be a quick overview. There's a lot that's going on in the book of Numbers. Yes, there are numbers, but that's not what the book is mainly about. Believe it or not, it's actually a lot more than numbers. So let's get started. Who recognizes this map? Too easy. What is it?
Masr Sina.
Okay, Masr, correct, Sina, and Judea, right? But what does the map represent? There's a path there.
Israelites out of Egypt.
Correct. It's the exile out of Egypt. The exodus out of Egypt into the promised land. Okay, so that's the entire trip, starting from Ramses, from Egypt, all the way down to Mount Sinai, and here an area called Wilderness of Paran. And then there's a detour, and actually some maps draw it a little bit too convoluted, like they go around so many times. And then eventually they make their way to Moab, across the Jordan River from Canaan. Okay? So I mentioned specifically some names because those are names that we're going to focus on. So let's start with the position and the timeline in the Bible. Actually, before I do that, well, you've already seen it, but what do we know about the book of Numbers? Anything do you know about the book of Numbers? Anything at all?
Names all of the tribes.
It names all the tribes, yeah, much like the 5 books of Moses, but yes, it does. What else? And the tribes are? How many? 12 tribes. Who are they? They're the sons of Jacob, right? So the 12 sons of Jacob had 12 sons and 1 daughter. The 12 sons of Jacob are the heads of the 12 tribes, right? Okay, what else do we know about the book of Numbers? Anything, just yell it out.
Book number 4.
Book number 4 in the Bible. And book number 4 in the 5 books that were written by Moses. Correct. Is it a historical book? Or is it a prophetical book? Or is it laws book? What do you think?
Historical.
It's actually very historical. It doesn't sound like it from its name, but there's actually a lot of history in it. Okay? Of the 5 books, 3 represent a big major chunk of history, and Numbers is one of them. And then 2 are more about laws, which is Leviticus and Deuteronomy. Okay, but the other 3, the Genesis, Exodus, and Numbers, actually tell a story. Okay, let's see what we've got here. So it's the 4th book. We know it picks up where Exodus and Leviticus stop. And it covers 40 years in the wilderness. So basically, almost the entire trip. Okay. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. The name. So the name Numbers comes from the fact that it starts with the very first chapter with the numbering of the people, right? The census. So it starts and it numbers every tribe and the sons of those tribes. But it focuses on people that are 20 years or older. People that are ready to go to war, okay? And we'll come to the number in a little bit. And believe it or not, towards the very end, it also ends with another census. Okay, so the book starts with census, ends with census, and that's why it's called Numbers. But in Hebrew tradition, they actually don't call it that. They call it Bamidbar, which actually means in the wilderness, which is more reflective of what's in the book. The book actually talks about what happens to the Israelites in the wilderness during that 40-year period. Okay, it's not just about numbers, but it just so happens that in the Bible it's called Numbers. Okay, what's the focus of the book? It focuses on repeated cycles of things that tend to happen in over and over and over again. The Israelites rebel, God gets angry, Moses intercedes, God and people repent, God relents or decides on some kind of response. Okay, sometimes the response is pretty harsh, sometimes it's lenient, but throughout the entire history, you can see God's faithfulness despite the Israelites' lack of faithfulness. Okay, so it's pretty important that way. And everything you hear about in the Israelites, it's easy for us to judge and say, like, give it up. Like, seriously, you'll be over and over and over again, you're rebelling. You see a miracle, and then the next day you're rebelling. Well, it's not the next day. In the Bible, it's the next chapter. But it's over a 40-year period. But guess what? We do the same thing. And so as we reflect through what they're doing, I want us all to be thinking about, do we not do that ourselves? God shows us how merciful He is, and God shows us His miracles, and God shows us His incredible mercy and giving, and yet we rebel. We may not rebel by going up and saying, God, I don't like what you're doing. We do sometimes, but we rebel in other ways, right? By not following His commandments, by not really adhering to the Christian way of life, and so on. So just keep that in the back of your mind. I am not going to be spending a whole lot of time on that because there's a lot to cover in that book. But it's something that you should be cognizant of. From a geography point of view, which is why we've got a map here, the trip covers from Mount Sinai to the wilderness of Paran to the plains of Moab. So that's geographically, that's the period. So let's point out where that is. From Mount Sinai, it's right there, okay, on the map. So you could see they've already in the book of Exodus, they've already covered this part, okay, up to here. So and also in the book of Leviticus. Leviticus is not historical, as I mentioned. It's just more about laws, right? But it happened during that period. Where these two books leave off is at the bottom or at the foot of Mount Sinai, and that's where this book picks up, Book of Numbers, okay? And then, so this is a major station, and we're going to talk about it in a little bit more detail. The next station is in Paran. From Sinai to Paran, it actually doesn't take long, probably a few weeks, okay? They spend about a year here in Mount Sinai. This, and from here to here, actually is not that long a trip either. It doesn't take that long. The entire trip, by the way, on foot, if you haven't heard that already, most of you probably know, if you were to go from here to here on foot, it would take about 2 weeks, okay, on foot. Needless to say, with about 2 million people, it's going to take longer, right? Obviously, everybody's slowing down. People want to go to the bathroom. You know, it's hard to manage 2 million people. So it's going to take longer, but maybe double it, triple it. Like, it should have taken them no more than a couple of months, okay? But what happened is they spent about a year going from spending most of it here, but going from here to there, that's about a year. From here to Paran, to the next station that we're going to talk about, so from here to here, a few weeks, and there's no exact timing. And then here they make a huge mistake. And that mistake costs them 40 years of their lives. Okay? And so they end up going in loops and camping and so on for 40 years until finally they're on the last stretch, which is to the next station, which is Moab. And that's right there. And when they get to Moab, they're effectively across the Jordan River from Canaan. So they're right there. They're almost there. And we spend a whole lot of time there. By a whole lot of time, I don't mean years, but we don't know the exact timing again. I'm guessing months, roughly. Okay? The entire period takes about 40 years. Any questions on that? The next slide is the very last slide I'm going to show you. But it's a slide we're going to spend the bulk of the time on. Okay, so the slide builds up. Okay? And I'm going to start with the 3 stations that we mentioned. Mount Sinai, Wilderness of Paran, Plains of Moab. Okay? And you can see this was very mountainous area. This was kind of in between. This is very plain level field. And by the time they get here, they're across the river from Canaan. So they're almost there. The book doesn't quite get them into Canaan. It stops just before. Okay, so just when they're about to cross the Jordan River. And it starts, as I said, at the foot of Mount Sinai. In terms of which chapters, let's look at that. So in Mount Sinai, the chapters that are covered here are 1 to 10, 10 verse 10. And then the next 2 chapters are actually between Mount Sinai and Paran. And then the next 7 chapters, Numbers 13 to 19, are spent in the wilderness of Paran. And then the next 2 chapters are between Paran and Moab. And finally, the last 15 chapters are all talking about what happened in Moab. Okay, and they have some very, very interesting stories there that we're gonna go over today. Most of which you already know, but you may not realize that they happen when they do. Okay, so the very first thing that happens in the book of Numbers, as I mentioned, chapter number 1, is the census. So they count the people that are the males that are ready to go to war at 20 years of age or older, and there's 603,550. Okay, roughly 600,000 people. So they estimate that the whole congregation was about 2 million people. Okay? And these are the people that got out of Egypt, and those are the people that are going to travel for the next 40 years. The next chapter talks about the formation of the camps. Now, I know this is small to see. By the way, how is the wording other than this? Is the wording, you can see it from everywhere? Okay, good. So if I click here, you can see it a little bit bigger here. This is how they formed their camps. God wanted to be right in the middle of them, so the tabernacle was in the middle. And then you could see the Levites surrounding the tabernacle by families. So Moses and the priests are here. The rest of the Levites are here. Who knows the function of the Levites? Okay, serving God, serving the altar, but they're not all priests. The priests were the family of Aaron and his family. These are the priests. So think of them as like deacons, okay, super deacons. So they serve and they help, but they're not priests. They're not allowed to do the things that Aaron and his family are allowed to. Okay, so these are all the Levites around them, and then the 12 tribes are around him. 3 here, 3 here, 3 here, and 3 here. What's wrong with the numbers I just mentioned? How many tribes? And the Levites? 13. Why? Yes. Joseph's 2 sons were split into 2 separate tribes, correct. So Ephraim and Manasseh were both both Joseph's son. But in camping and in dividing the lands and so on, they actually take two different spots. They're treated like 2 different tribes. And the Levites don't, because they're dedicated to God. Okay? And they're actually honored in that way. Okay, so let's go back. And go to the next chapter. The Levites, I was going to get into, let me focus on numbers rather than going all over the map, because like I said, there's a whole lot to cover here. So in number 3, he starts numbering the Levites, but he numbers them separately, and so consider this part of the census, but it's a separate from the way he counted the rest of the tribes. He didn't count them with them. And their numbers, there was something interesting that happened in chapter 3. God said that the firstborn, remember when he was in Egypt, he said the firstborn of each family is dedicated to me, right? To God. Here he says, I'm going to take the Levites instead of the firstborns of everybody. So they'll replace the firstborns. But here's an interesting thing. He counted the firstborns of the entire population of Israelites, and there was 22,273. He counted the Levites, and there was 22,000. So there's 273 left, right? And for those, they had to offer like oxen and sheep and stuff like that to replace as a makeup number, to make up the number, to be redeemed, and with silver as well. And those redemptions were paid to Aaron. Okay? In chapter 4, and all the way to chapter 10, he covers quite a few things. So in chapter 4, he focuses on the liturgical services to each family, specifically to the 3 families of the Levites, and Aaron's family, of course. And in chapter 5, he talks about cleansing the camp of sin. He talks about confessions. He gives them laws regarding sin and so on. In chapter 6, he gives them more laws about the Nazarites. Nazarites are those people that are dedicated to God. So they're like Samson, for example, if you remember, right? So he wasn't allowed to cut his hair. He was not allowed to have any hard drinks and so on. So these are people that are dedicated to God for life. John the Baptist as well is another Nazarite. Okay. And in chapter 8, he talks about laws for the lamps of the sanctuary and where they go and what they need to be. He talks about the consecration of the Levites. In chapter 9, he goes into the laws around and the rules around keeping the Passover, the feast of the Passover, and the traditions for celebrating it. And he talks to them about, and he starts introducing to them the concept of the cloud, following the cloud by day, and the fire by night, okay, in their travel through the wilderness. You guys are familiar with this, right? So this was his way of showing his presence in leading them in their journey from one end of the trip to the other. And finally, in chapter 10, he talks about a trumpet that he told Moses to create and to blow whenever he wants to gather people around him. It's a lot of people, right? And he needs the way to manage them out. So that's kind of the majority of, these are the 10 chapters that talk about this station at Mount Sinai, at the foot of Mount Sinai. Now we get into the next part of the trip, which is from between Mount Sinai and Paran. And as I mentioned, there's only 2 chapters here. In chapter 11, Israel complains. And this is probably the first complaint we talk about here in this chapter, but you'll hear this word a lot. What do you think they're complaining about the first time? Yeah, the manna. Is that what you said? Yeah, they complain about the manna. Enough of this bread already. It was like a little bit of bread, right? We want to have some real flesh, like meat. We want to have, we cherish the fish that we ate in Egypt. We cherish the food that we had in Egypt. We cherish the pomegranates and the figs and the grapes and all these things. And we can't just have manna and start complaining. And they're not. One of the things you'll notice is God gets mad, gets angry with them. It's not because they don't have the right to complain, but because they are complaining rather than asking. They don't come and ask for things or pray for it. Instead, they're complaining. And when they complain, they sometimes start making decisions that are against God's will. And so Moses at this point gets frustrated. It's a little early still in the trip for him, but he's already fed up, and he says, he starts complaining himself. God, like, why did I create those people? Did I bear them in my womb? Why do I have to carry them and carry the responsibility? Why me? Why, like, if this is how it's going to be, let me die already. Like, he's already given up, right? And so God tells them, look, you don't have to do it all alone. Pick 70 people, elders from the tribes, from the 12 tribes, and I will take from your spirit and put on them so they can help you going forward. And he does that. And then for the people that are complaining, God actually gives them what? Quail. And he says, you're going to have quail. Quail are like little birds. Okay, so he sends them quail in like huge numbers. Okay, huge numbers, that miles and miles of quail stacked on the ground, and they could just eat their fill for months. Okay, and he said you're gonna eat it until it comes out of your nostrils. Like you're gonna say enough. You're gonna have so much of it, you're not gonna want anymore. But people didn't just eat it; they lusted for it and ate it with lust. So much so that God got so mad at them, and he sent them a plague, and it started killing so many people because those people that ate with lust and were very lustful about it. At that point, Miriam and Aaron started complaining. Who knows what they were complaining about? Anyone? They were starting to complain about Moses himself. They were going, Moses, like, you're not the only one that God talks to. Why should it all be you? We're just as good. And God gets so furious with them because it was God who picked Moses. And it was God later on in the book says, Moses, forget everything else. Moses is the only one that I've talked face to face to. Moses is the only one I chose. You guys, you have no right to question this or do anything. And he got very furious with them. And what was their punishment? Anyone knows?
White spots.
Miriam became leprous, right? So yeah, did I put it here? Yeah, Miriam became leprous, and Aaron was Aaron as the priest had to do some prayers and had to treat her a certain way and had to put her out of the camp, and so he was so anxious because he knows he deserves it just as much as she did. He was also a complainer, and so he went and begged Moses to pray to God to forgive her and to cleanse her. Moses did pray, and God told him, well, look, at least kick her out of the camp for 7 days, and then she'll be fine. Okay, she'll be purified and she'll come back. So they did. She ran out of the camp for 7 days to be because she was leprous, and after a week she did come back. And that is the end of those two chapters, and that takes us to the next station in the wilderness of Paran. So, very first thing I said, if you remember in the last slide, I said that at the beginning of the period in Paran, they made a mistake that costed them 40 years of their lives. At that point, they were already halfway through, right? And they had spent about a year from the time they left Egypt. And if you were to just extrapolate, it would be maybe another year. Like, it really doesn't take that long. Maybe it should have taken less than a month, but let's say another year, and they should be in Canaan. What costed them 40 years? Why did they end up spending 40 years in the wilderness? Anybody knows? I know you know. I know some of you know. Speak up.
Afraid of the enemy?
Yeah. Yes. What happened is they sent 12 people, one from every tribe, to spy the land of Canaan. Remember, the land of Canaan was about, I said the whole trip is about 2 weeks. So at this point, it was only a week travel. Okay? It took them 40 days to go, spy, and come back. So a week going, a week coming back, that's 14 days, and the rest of the days, I guess they spent there spying. Okay, figuring out the land, the people, the army, whether the city was walled, like everything about it, so that they can come and tell Moses, what to expect and how to get ready to attack, right? Because they were going to go take it over. Okay, so those 12 people go there and they love the land. The land is amazing, okay? There's so many fruits and the land just luscious and just so beautiful, right? One of the interesting things that they saw there was they were able to carry back to the tribes one cluster of grapes, and that one cluster was so big that two of them had to carry it with a pole in the middle between them. So they put it on a pole, and two of them had to carry it. That's how big a cluster of grapes was, to tell people how good the land was, right? They brought figs, they brought pomegranates, and they brought other things. Okay, great. So every one of the 12 agreed that the land was amazing and great and really worth going to, right? But 10 of the 12, as you said, were afraid. Why? Because the people that lived in Canaan were giants. And they came back and said, there's no way we're going to make it. There's no way we're going to be able to beat them. They're going to destroy us. They're going to annihilate us. Let's not even think about it. It's just forget it. Let's just go back. Okay? And 2 people of the 12 said, no way. God promised that we're going to take that land. We're going. God is there. He's going to make it. He's going to allow us to take it over. Don't worry about it. You've got it. You've got it, Israel. We're going to make it, right? But what happens is the 10 people convince the rest of the population, of the Israelites. And so the rest of them get scared. They spend that night weeping and crying. And by morning, they start murmuring against Moses and Aaron. They start actually plotting to kill Moses and Aaron and electing another leader who can take them back to Egypt. Okay? They don't want to go there. They don't want to take the risk. They figured we're doomed. Let's cut our losses and just head back. Okay? Sorry? So at that point, Moses gets very frustrated with the congregation, of course, and he starts crying to God. And God, needless to say, was very upset with them. And he said, okay, you don't want to get into the promised land? You're not going to get into the promised land. I'll give you what you want. But you're not going back either. Because your kids don't deserve to go back and be slaves in Egypt again. I got him out with a strong arm. I'm going to get him in. Just not you. Okay, so everybody who's 20 years and older is not going to make it to Canaan. 2 exceptions. Who are the 2 exceptions? Sorry? Joshua and Caleb. The 2 spies who came and said, this is a good land, let's go, God will make it. Those 2 were the only 2 of the 603,000 people, 550, who left Egypt. Only 2 people made it to the promised land. Joshua and Caleb. Okay? The rest were to die in the wilderness over the next 40 years. And that's why they spent 40 years in that trip until everybody got older enough, I guess. So 20 years and older means by 40 years later, they were 60 years and older. So all these people were white. All of them died. And only those 2 people made it. But their kids who were under 20 years were the ones that had grown old enough to enter Canaan.
So maybe Joshua and Caleb alone, or Joshua and Caleb and all of their people?
Alone.
Just the 2 people?
Just the 2 people. Okay? But of course, we're exempting again everybody who's under 20. So everybody under 20 was allowed to go in. Okay, because they weren't adult enough. They weren't considered adults to make the decision. The people that made the decision against God were their parents, and so they were allowed to grow and be admitted into be given the choice. I should say, actually, they were given that choice in the next book, Deuteronomy, to actually get into the promised land.
And I'm guessing with God's fairness, He gave Moses the understanding to know that everyone that's 20 and above actually all complain. Like, is it?
Well, God is fairer than me and you for sure. So yes, He knew everybody deserved not to go in. He picked 2 people out of the entire 605. So obviously he knew who to give exception to. Everybody else deserved not to go, including Moses, by the way, but not for that reason. Okay, I'll come back to why Moses didn't make it. Different reason. But but God said, okay, I'm going to give the people what they want. They don't want to get in, they're not going to get in. Okay? But they're not going back either. All right. So at that point, and I already mentioned that they wanted to, they even wanted to stone Caleb and Joshua, not just kill Moses and go back, but they also wanted to stone Caleb and Joshua. And one verse here, verse 14, if I'm not mistaken, of that chapter, is where God says one verse that if you were to summarize the entire book of Numbers, this one verse does it. The verse is God saying, how long will these people provoke me? I will strike them and destroy them. Like that's just because it happens over and over and over and over again, that one verse really summarizes the entire book. So let's go into the next chapter. Hold on. Yeah, so I already mentioned that. Israel rebels, plans to kill Moses and return to Egypt. That was chapter 14. Sorry, I forgot to click. And then the next chapter, chapter 15, is where God responds with two responses. The first response I already mentioned, that's the ban. So he banned anybody from going into the land. But those 10 people that came back and gave the bad report, those 10 people were actually plagued and died with a plague. Okay? So there was two separate punishments for them. And then the next is he gives them some more laws in chapter 15 about offerings and the Sabbath, keeping the Sabbath and so on. Okay? All right. Then a new story starts. It's the story of Korah. Now Korah is a Levite. He starts complaining, why is Aaron the only priest? Aaron is in the same tribe, remember? But only him and his family were allowed to be priests. So Korah is saying, I'm a Levite too. I can be a priest. Well, I want to offer incense to God and be on equal footing with Aaron and his family. And he grabs 250 people and they go march to Moses and start rebelling and saying, why are we treated differently? Why are we second class? And so Moses goes to God. Moses teaches us a great thing. He doesn't make a move without going to God first. Anything that comes to him, big or small, hard or easy, first thing he does is he goes to God. God, what do I do? And that's why God came and talked to him face to face, because he really doesn't want to live without God. He doesn't want to be doing anything without God's guidance. And so he was so faithful to God that way, except for one mistake. He'll do a little later. So what happened here is pretty interesting. Korah and those 250 people come and complain. So Moses says, okay, tomorrow morning you're going to get 250 censers. You offer, incense to God, and we'll see what God's response is. Okay? So God gives them a response, but it's a pretty harsh one. He says, everybody that does not associate themselves with Korah and his group and his families and his belongings, just keep yourself away from them. So everybody goes away. The earth opens up and swallows all their tents and housing and belongings and cattle and everything, and then closes its mouth again. They're gone. In an instant almost, they're gone. And the 250 people that were with him were consumed with fire from heaven. Okay? So it's a pretty harsh judgment, but it shows that God is a jealous God as well, right? That he's merciful, and yes, he has patience, but there comes a time when you step your boundaries and you don't understand where to stop, and God has sometimes a very harsh response. Then we get into chapter 17, where there's another rebellion. Heard enough of the word rebellion so far? That one is, they're complaining about, sorry, this is chapter 17. I sometimes get lost even between which complaint is which one. By then, so many people had been killed, right? Levites, like people that were supposedly God's people, right? Like these are the people that were dedicated to God. And so people actually complained against Moses. They said, because of you, God killed so many people. so many thousands of people. As a matter of fact, I think the number was 15,000 here. Why? And start complaining against Moses. So, God, and sorry, the people that were killed before were not 15,000. The people that are going to get killed now are the 15,000. So God actually sends a plague because he's now even more furious with them. He sends a plague that kills 15,000 people. But Moses, being as patient as he is, he told Aaron, quickly get your incense and go start offering sacrifices to God for atonement for the people so that the plague can stop. So Aaron literally ran, took his incense, took his censer, put incense in it, starts offering and making atonement, and runs between the people, and the plague is gradually killing people, right? And so Aaron catches up to the plague and stops between the people that were killed by the plague and the people that weren't, and that's when it stops. That's when the plague stops. So when Aaron positions himself between those two groups, the plague stops and God relents at that point. In the same chapter, in chapter 17, God wants to teach him something. Not only did I choose Moses to be my servant and my prophet and the prophet for me, I'm also the one who chose Aaron. So he told Moses, ask the leaders from all the tribes to bring the rod. Okay? Put their name, inscribe their names on it, and Aaron was one of them. Put his name on it, and he's going to put those rods in the tabernacle, and the next morning we'll see what happens. So the next morning, what happens to the rod of Aaron? It sprouts, right? And starts blossoming, even though it's just a piece of wood, right? And nothing happens to the rest. So it was God's sign that I chose Aaron, and I can make the impossible happen with him. I did not choose the rest of you. You're not on equal footing. Don't even try. Okay? What do we, in our church, we say that the rod of Aaron represents who? Saint Mary. Why?
She gives birth to Christ without the seed of man, and the rod blossoms.
Much like the hard wood piece give sprouted and blossomed without it being even alive. In chapter 18 and 19, he starts giving them even more laws about priesthood and about tithing, and purification, and a few other things. Now that takes us to the next station, or the next part of the trip, which is now between Paran and Moab. So they spend the majority of the time already, okay, the majority of that 40 years, and they're kind of in the last stretch now. And once again, Israel does what? What do you do best? They rebel, they complain, right? And this time, they're complaining about being thirsty, okay? So there's no water, we haven't had water for a while, they're complaining, they're rebelling, and again, rather than praying and asking, they're showing up in rebellion. So God orders Moses to do what? How is God going to respond to the request for water? Sorry? Yeah, the rock. So I actually told Moses to talk to the rock. Okay? Moses was so mad at the people, and also somewhat disbelieving. Like he goes to the people and goes, Am I gonna get you water out of a rock? Like he was not quite believing it himself, and rather than do what God told him, which is talk to the rock, he hit the rock twice. And because he showed his disrespect or disbelief in what God orders him in front of the congregation, that was his punishment, was that he wouldn't make it to the promised land himself. Okay? To Canaan.
So this is the second time? First time is to hit the rock, second time is to talk to it?
No, he just told them to talk to it.
So it didn't happen twice?
No. No, did you think it did? No.
Yeah.
Right?
Hey,
Yeah.
was the punishment so severe because he was so clear with them?
Yeah, God's instructions to Moses have always been very clear. Moses knows God by now, and he's talked to him face to face. He knows God. He should know that when God tells him talk to the rock, he should be talking to the rock. So, but Moses was upset, and he was really frustrated. And it seems to me, and maybe that's just my interpretation, that he was also a little bit disbelieving, right? Like, I'm gonna get water out of a rock? And he shouldn't have. He's seen even mightier things happen, right? So yes, that was his punishment, and it was for both him and Aaron as well. So at that point, around that point, we're now in chapter 20. Yeah, we're still in chapter 20. Mary dies, and shortly thereafter, Aaron dies. Okay, so they both die each, they're mourned for about 30 days. That was the tradition, and each one separately. And who takes Aaron's place? Anyone? His son, Eliezer. Okay, Elazar. So Eliezer, his son, takes his place. He becomes the priest. He's given the ephod and all the garments and the blessings and everything, even before Aaron dies. And then Aaron passes away. In chapter 20, before the end of chapter 20, one more story happens. They were now starting to get closer to Canaan, and so they were now starting to get to a lot of people that were living in those lands, right? And the first group that they passed by was people of Edom, and so they sent a request, a peaceful request, saying, "Look, can we just pass through your land? And we're not going to touch anything. We're not going to reach out for any vineyards. We're not going to use your water wells. We're just going to pass right through and just allow us to do that. We're going to do it peacefully." Edom didn't like it. They tried again. He said no. They said, "Can we go through your land, but on a mountainous area? Like, it'll be more difficult for us. We'll go on the mountain, but it's still within their lands." And he said no. So they avoided Edom altogether, and they went out through a much larger trip. You'll hear a similar story happen later, but in the future ones, they actually fight, and we'll get into that in a second. But with Edom, they did not fight. Who knows the tribe of Edom or that group Edom? Who knows what are they the descendants of? Who are they the descendants of in the Bible? Do you know? Yeah, Esau. Right? So they're actually cousins. Like the tribes of Israel are sons of Jacob, and Edom are sons of Esau, right? So they're cousins, but they wouldn't let them. So now we get into chapter 21. I already covered Miriam and Aaron dying. So chapter 21, Israel complains. And this time, they're complaining about both water and food. They're discouraged. They just had enough of this trip. They've been there for so many years. Most of them have died. Most of the people that got out of Egypt have died already. So they're very discouraged. And God responds heavily again, and he sends what punishment this time? So we've seen plagues, we've seen fire, we've seen earth opening its mouth and swallowing people. I think that's mostly it. This time it was a little different.
Was it the locust?
No. Yes, serpents, right? So venomous serpents come and start killing them all. Like a lot of them, right? And so people cry, we've sinned, like they always do. Moses goes, prays to God. Okay, they've sinned. Could you please stop this? He goes, okay, fine. Create a serpent of copper and put it on a pole, straight pole. And whoever looks at it, whoever gets bitten by a venomous serpent and looks at that pole, at the copper serpent, will be saved. The venom will not affect him. What does that pole, that copper serpent on a pole represent? Foreshadowing the cross, which is why it's drawn here like a cross. This is just an artistic visualization. But it was just a straight pole. But here the artist just decided to make it look like a cross to remind us that it was foreshadowing the cross of Jesus. When we're in sin and we look at the cross, we're saved, right? And in much the same way, like they were asked to do. Now, from so by that point they had reached Mount Hor, and very close to Moab. And between Mount Hor and Moab, they had 3 battles, and they defeated them all. They defeated the king of Arad, they defeated King Sihon of the Amorites, and they defeated King Og of Bashan. By the way, the first one originally defeated them, so they cried to God, and God said, "Okay, now you're coming to me. Fine, you're gonna have battle again and defeat them," and they did. Okay, so when they did seek God's help, God was faithful and fulfilled His promise. Now we get into the plains of Moab. An interesting story here happens. So all these kings I just mentioned, I think I mentioned about 5 of them, 4 or 5 of them. Oh, one of those battles had 5 kings in it. So all of these were wiped, annihilated. Israelites were gaining a lot of not popularity, but a huge reputation in the area. Everybody in the area heard about him. So who hears of him and gets scared? King Balak of Moab. Okay, so basically the area they were at now, that's Moab. The king of that area, his name was King Balak. He gets really scared. He knows he's no match to their numbers and their power, and so he decides to go another route. He knows that if he goes in battle, he's just going to be defeated. So he decides to do a tricky way. He calls a prophet, not Jewish prophet, from the area, from actually an area called the Midianites, right next to Moab. The area is Midian, the people are Midianites. And that person his name is Balaam. And he calls him, he sends messages to him, and he says, I want you to come. We have people that are coming over from Egypt. They're huge in numbers. They're going to just take over the entire area. I want you to come and curse them, because I know that whoever you bless will be blessed, and whoever you curse will be cursed. So Balaam says to the messengers, okay, wait till morning. I'm going to ask God's guidance, and I'll give you the answer tomorrow. Sure enough, God, our God, God of the Israelites, talks to him. Who are these people that are coming to see you? Oh, these are people from Moab, who are worried about the Israelites that are coming from Egypt and want me to go and curse them. God goes, you're going to curse my people? No, you can't go with them. So the first time he says, you can't go with them. So he wakes up in the morning and says, sorry guys, can't go. So they return back. They go to the king and say, he won't come. So he sends more people, more honorable, more gifts to Balak and says, please come. I'll make you happy. I'll make it worth your time. I'll just give you whatever you want. And he had so many promises. So Balak goes, look guys, I can't say anything that God doesn't allow me to say. Okay? But stay the night. I'll ask God's guidance. I'll let you know in the morning. Comes back in the morning. This time God talks to him. And God says, okay, go with them. If they ask you to go, again, go with them. But only say what I tell you to say. And take it easy, right? So God's giving him some instructions. Obviously, he didn't quite follow the instructions because he was too anxious to go. He was promised so many good things. He really wanted to go. He just couldn't do it without God's permission. So he wakes up like early in the morning. Before they even ask him or anything, he jumps on his donkey and goes, right? And tells them, of course, and he goes. And he takes 2 servants with him. Well, what happens is God gets upset with him. So he sends him an angel in his way. Okay? And the angel is right in front of him. The donkey sees the angel. He doesn't. So the donkey veers off into the fields. And so he gets upset, starts hitting the donkey to get him back on track. Donkey gets back on track on the road. So now the angel waits until they go into an area where it's between 2 walls. I don't know if you can see it well here, so I made it a little bit bigger for you. Okay, so in between 2 walls. So the donkey squeezes against the wall because he's trying to avoid the angel in a way, right? So he crushes his leg. He crushes Balaam's leg. So Balaam gets even more mad and starts hitting him. The angel then a third time goes into an area that's really, really narrow. There's no way they can avoid him, right? So now the donkey just goes down, right? Decides not to move at all. And at that point, Balaam just loses it. He starts hitting him hard. And who knows what happens? The donkey speaks, right? This is the first and only time in the Bible where an animal actually speaks. History, not just the Bible. And says, what have I done to you? Have I not been your faithful donkey for all these years? Why are you hitting me? And at that point, his eyes open up and sees the angel. And the angel actually blames him for being so blinded by his own desires and lusts to just go despite what God told him to do. And so he says, look, I'll go back. If you want me to go back, I'll go back. I didn't see you, this and that. Starts giving him excuses. And so the angel tells him, no, it's okay. Go. But again, be careful what you say and what you do. I will tell you what to do when you get there, and only say what I tell you to say. So he goes, and the king asks him to come and curse the people. So he says, well, look, I can only say what God tells me to say. So God tells him, so he goes off, seeks God's guidance. God tells him specific wording to tell to Balak. He comes back and starts, instead of cursing, he starts blessing the people and giving them all these glorified words and stuff like that. Balak gets upset. So he goes, you know what? Let me take you somewhere else. Okay, so he takes him to another area on another mountain where he can see all the people and says, look how many there are. They're going to wipe us out. 2 million people almost, right? So maybe God will be happy having you curse them from here. Once again, something happens. 3 times he does that. Finally, the king says, you know what? I don't want you here. I don't want to hear from you. The God you're talking about has forfeited you huge prizes, huge benefits and things, wealth that I was going to give you. But you don't. I'm not going to give you anything now. Just go back home. And at that point, Balak says, look, I told you already from the beginning, I can't say a word. Even if you were to give me your entire kingdom, I can't say a word that God doesn't permit me to do. And then he starts prophesying. So he actually has a 4th prophecy where he also, in the 3rd and the 4th, he prophesies about Jesus, about the coming of a king later on who's going to reign and lead Israel and so on. So his prophecy is in that chapter, in chapter 24, 23 and 24, I believe. And then he leaves and goes back home. Now, at that point, the story of Balak and Balaam ends, or seems to end. He's mentioned later on in the book, and there's reference that people infer to mean the following story that I'm going to tell you. It's not quite explicitly stated, but it's inferred from what's being said later. What happened is he was a very tricky man. So even though he was a prophet, that Balaam, so he figured he's not going to be able to curse the people, right? So what he's going to do is he's going to figure out a different way. And the different way is, he told the king, look, if you make those people sin, then their God is not going to be with them anymore. So what you do is you offer your daughters of Moab, to them, let them sin with them, let them entice them into sin, and if they fall in sin, their God's going to be mad at them, and then you'll be able to defeat them and do whatever. Right? And he did that. And a lot of people fell with a plague because of that sin, but we'll talk about that later in another chapter. No, actually, the very next chapter. Oops. Sorry, wrong click. Oh, no. Okay. So, you can't see. No, it's on my end. Yeah. There you go. Okay, so the next chapter, chapter 25, people sin. And they sin with the daughters of Moab. And not only that, they actually pull them into consecrating themselves to Baal, their god. Okay, and so many people start consecrating themselves to Baal, not just sin and adultery, and so these people get killed. God kills them, sends them a plague, and kills them. But then a guy has the tenacity to take a woman in front of everybody's, in the sight of everyone, including Moses, and takes her into a tent to offer her to his brother. And so Phineas is the grandson of Aaron. So he's the son of Eleazar. Eleazar is now the priest, the high priest. His son, Phineas, gets so jealous and zealous for God, and so he takes a spear and goes into the tent and kills both, the man and the Moabite girl. And God was so pleased that Phineas had that zeal in him, and that he really wanted to clear the Israelites of sin and of sin and just clear it for God. He really did it out of love for God. And so God gave him a huge promise that he will have his priesthood forever, him and his descendants.
All right, question, just timeline. At that point, we still don't have commandments yet, right? He still hasn't received the commandments.
Commandments came on Mount Sinai, so this was before.
Earlier, so
this was before we started.
But despite the zeal, isn't that technically still murder? Well, not technically, it is murder.
Yeah, but it's murder for God. So God did allow murder back then for people that sinned. You gotta understand that the times are a little different. So it's not, you can't really compare it to the way things are now. But back then, God was treating them like kids who didn't quite understand the level of spirituality that we now are expected to understand. So they were treated like sin is to be cut. When you kill sinful people, when you kill all these groups and tribes that are in the way because they're doing very sinful practices, like passing their daughters in fire and offering their sons to their gods and stuff like that. He's actually telling them, you gotta kill them. Like, don't keep any alive, because he wanted to teach them that sin is not accommodated in any way. It needs to be cut. So when Eliezer did that, he did that in the spirit of God. He did it because he knew that God was going to get mad. And God was actually very mad. A plague had started to already kill all the people because of that sin. And this guy is just in the daylight in front of everybody, is going further and just pretending like he doesn't care. So Phineas so Phineas went and killed him. And when he did that, God actually stopped the plague. So God actually saw that as a very honorable move, because it was done out of zeal for God and for eliminating sin. So think of it more as eliminating sin rather than killing.
It was also, it's important to note that it was not a personal vendetta. It's nothing personal between two people, but it's something kind of corporate. That's one thing. And he is a priest, and he has kind of an authority to pass judgment at this time. So it's someone who has the authority to pass this judgment, and he was because he was a priest. And it's not a personal vendetta. I mean, it's not that this is legalizing killing. This is not also legalizing that if I see something wrong and I go kill the person. No, but it has to be not personal, and I have to have the authority and the ability. It's like when Jesus went and cleansed the temple, only Jesus can do this. Not only one can just go with a whip. And another thing, of course, Jesus did not whip or hurt anyone. He was just using the sound of the whip. Sometimes we think Jesus went to the temple with the whip. He was hitting people left and right. No, that's not. This is our own imagination. This is when we are angry, maybe this is what we would do. But God's anger is completely different. God has anger, yes. But God's anger is not is not fluctuating, but it is not out of reactivity to emotions like us, but it is based on fair judgment. So he was authorized to judge as a priest, and it was not a personal vendetta.
Very good point. Thank you. At that point, we get into chapter 26, where this is so the last few chapters, you'll see that there's one more block that I'm going to add here. They're not necessarily in chronological order. So the way I see it is basically at the very end, he starts at the very beginning with the census, and almost at the very end, he has another census. But guess, is he counting the same people? No. All of them are gone. This is the new generation now that is going to enter into Canaan, right? So none of those 603,000 people, those 601,000 people, only 2 people are counted twice between those two. Okay. Well, Moses at that point hadn't died yet, so maybe 3. But basically, the entire 600,000 number is made up of entirely new generation now. That is the generation that will go in, and it's almost the same number as you can see, pretty close. So roughly, again, we could estimate about 2 million people going into the promised land. And that takes us to the last 10 chapters of the book, where a lot of things, not a lot of things happen, but so many laws and and a few things intermingled a little bit, so they're not quite time placed. There were more laws about offerings and vows and how to do them. There was also a war, that was misspelled, against the Midianites. Who remembers the Midianites? I mentioned them once before. Do you remember? This is the group from which someone came. Balaam. Remember that prophet that was... so Balaam himself was killed in that war.
Balaam was one that was offering the offerings so that Balaam can curse the people, right?
Correct. And he's the one that tricked them into sinning. He was killed himself in that war. And then at that point, God tells Moses, okay, this is the end of your trip. You're going to have to now pass over to Joshua. And he brought Eliezer. Eliezer is now the high priest. Told them, to do the ordinances to basically ordain him to be the successor for Moses. And we're almost there now at Canaan. So the very next step now is going into Canaan. But it doesn't quite happen in this book. When does it happen? So if you look at the next book, Deuteronomy, you guys are going to study that next week. The very end of Deuteronomy kind of goes in parallel with the book of Numbers. The very end of Deuteronomy actually talks about Moses dying. So in this book, it doesn't actually mention it. It alludes to it, because God tells them right after that war with the Midianites, you're gonna be counted with your people, which is the terminology that the Bible uses for passing on. But it doesn't actually mention it in the book. In the book of Deuteronomy, very last paragraph, it actually says, and Moses passes away. And then the next book that takes over is Joshua. Because remember, Deuteronomy is not a historical book again. It's one of those laws books. But the next book after that, which is book number 6 in the Bible, Joshua takes over the story now. When Joshua takes over and starts crossing the Jordan River into Canaan. Okay, so you guys are going to probably cover that in a couple of weeks. So just a couple of things before we wrap up. In terms of timeline, how old was Moses when he died? Which is at the end of the trip, at the end of this book anyways. Does anybody know? Roughly 120 years. Okay? Of those, how many were here in the book of Numbers? 40. So that leaves how many years? 80 that were covered in the book of Exodus. Okay? So if you look from the beginning of the Bible, Genesis covers roughly about 2,300 years. So a long span of time. Okay? And then you'll see the next 4 books that were written by Moses are all within a very small period. Basically 120 years. Moses' life. Because Exodus starts with his birth until he comes to until Exodus, until he leaves Egypt, and then Numbers. So that's 80 years, and then Numbers takes the next 40 years, and the other two books are not historical, so they're just happening in parallel. Both Leviticus and Deuteronomy. And I think that's all I've got. I will stop here, and if there are any questions or comments, I'll let everyone answer. Anything else?
No question. This means that you read this book this week.
It's an amazing book. It really is. With a few chapters that talk a lot about laws. As you can see, they're not that many, but they are interspersed, and some chapters that talk about numbers, which are a little harder to read because you're literally just reading numbers after numbers after numbers. The rest are just a lot of very interesting stories, some weird ones like the donkey talking, some repetitive, but all of them again are just about rebellion, which again we tend to do. So let's look at ourselves. We rebel, and then God gets upset. Maybe we go confess, we repent, God relents, and then we go through the same cycle again. So we need to learn from that book a lot.
So 2 questions. Was there hatred amongst the tribes when the Levites were chosen to be just solely for God?
It doesn't. That book doesn't mention that. I don't think there was hatred against them, but there were, even within the Levites, there was rebelling, as you've seen, right? Like why should you, Moses, be the only one? Why should Aaron be the only high priest, or his family be the high priest? So yeah, there was a little bit of contention, but I don't think there was hatred. As a matter of fact, so later on, does the Book of Numbers mention it? No, the Book of Deuteronomy does. What happens is when they split the land, they don't give the Levites land, their own land. So they split the land of Canaan. Oh, I forgot to mention one thing that happens in the Book of Numbers in a second. But so they split amongst the 12 tribes, counting Joseph's sons as 2. So they give them the 12 pieces. But then they tell them within each land, you gotta appoint cities for the Levites. So he wanted the Levites to be spread between the tribes. So they have people that do service within the tribe. So they actually were living right next to all of the tribes, right? And they were God's people. They were the people that were called upon to make offerings and stuff like that.
And the second question, during the times where they would rebel and then they would sin and then God would punish them and then they would pray, they would apologize, and then their leader would pray on their behalf. And then God relents. So my understanding is that God is all-knowing, that I know. So if he knew that they were, in their essence, they were bad, they were going to continue to rebel, they were going to continue to come back to point zero of the same state of complaints and wrongdoings. How is that repentance kind of seen? Is it, because it's not being benched, so is it to show them his mercy, or is it that he kind of backs up on his decision?
I'll tell you my response, and I'll ask Abuna to weigh in as well. So, number one, I didn't quite explicitly mention it, but there were times when God was so frustrated with them that he actually told Moses, I'm going to wipe them off the face of this earth, and I'm going to start a whole new nation with you and your family. And it was Moses who actually said, no, you can't do that. What would people say? That their God took them out of Egypt with a mighty hand so that he could destroy them in the wilderness because he couldn't get them into Canaan? So Moses was playing a little bit of emotional response to God. Would God actually change his mind and actually, what's the word you used? That regret the decisions he made? No, he's all-knowing. I think God is doing all of this to teach us a lesson. That he's willing to actually change or appear to be changing his decisions and his words if we come back and actually confess our sins and repent. I look at all of these stories as lessons for us. What do we learn from it? He doesn't want people to go, well, everything is preordained and predetermined, and so why should I do anything different? Why should I try and do anything? God already knows what I'm going to do, and He's already predisposed of my destination. No. Even God Himself is showing us in the Bible that He's willing to relent and He's willing to change His mind. Remember that story of the king that was, can't remember the name right now, that he was going to die, knew he was dying, and God sent him a message that he was dying, and he cried and cried and cried, and God decided, okay, I'm going to change, and I'm going to give you 15 extra years in your life. So there are several stories in the Bible where it says God relented, and He did that. That's how I feel. What do you think?
It shows that God is changing His mind, but actually it's not God who's changing His mind. We are the ones changing. And actually this is to our advantage. Because it shows us God's mercy. I once heard like a very nice kind of analogy or imagery to help us understand. Imagine two circles. God's mercy and God's judgment. So it depends where I place myself. So my faith leads my actions, and my action places me in one of these two circles. So my actions that are coming from righteousness, that are coming from repentance, I am basically moving from God's judgment towards God's mercy. When I walk away, when I rebel, I cannot rebel under God. Rebel does not go along with repentance. So rebelling is I am moving myself from the circle of mercy to the circle of judgment. And when I repent, this is when I move back to God's circle of judgment. So by my actions, I am the one placing myself here or there. And as we're going to see, even at the end of the book of Deuteronomy, is God is telling them, you have way of life and you have the path of death. This is the path of death, this is the path of life, this is the actions, this is the consequences of death, these are the consequences of life. Choose life. So God says these are two paths, kind of two circles or two paths. This is the characteristics and this is the end, and this is the characteristic, this is the end. And God says, it's your choice. It's your call. If you choose the path of life, you're going to be in life. If you choose the path, the characteristics of death, then you're going to be in the path of death.
I did forget to mention one line here. So just before the book ends, 2 tribes, 2.5 to be exact, came to Moses and said, you know what, we're very happy with the land east of the Jordan River. We don't want to cross over. We want to stay here. Just the 2 tribes, want to stay here and take that to be our land. And by the way, when you cross over, we're not expecting to get another land there. That will be our inheritance. Is that okay with you? And Moses at first got upset and he said, what are you trying to do? Are you trying to do the same things your fathers did and not cross over to the Jordan and cause all kinds of trouble and whatever? And they said, no, we're going to cross over with you. We're going to fight with you. We're going to do everything you're expecting us to do, and we'll help our brothers, the rest of the tribes, take over their land. And when everything is settled, then we'll come back to our families. It's just that we really like this land because it's good for cattle and we have a lot of cattle. So we'd like to settle here. So Moses said, that's okay. As long as you promise, you're going to come and fight with your brothers and you're going to do everything that everybody else does. Your brothers, I mean the remaining 10 tribes or 9.5 tribes. And then once everything's settled, then you can come back to your land. But if you want to start settling now, that's okay. And he gave them the permission to do that. And that was the very last thing in the book of Numbers, just before they crossed over. Everybody else was west of the Jordan River, as I showed you on the map. There. So they wanted to settle here, and everybody else was going to go here. All right. Thank you, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you, Maggie. Thank you very much. This was really very helpful, insightful, refreshing.